It was a quiet evening in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The streets buzzed with the usual rhythm of life: kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting on porches, and the occasional bark of a dog. But what started as an ordinary day quickly turned into a life-altering event for one man. On the surface, he seemed like any other person, dressed casually, walking home after a long day. His name was Marcus, a calm and soft-spoken man who preferred to keep to himself. Marcus had lived in the community for years, but not everyone in town treated him like he belonged. The color of his skin made him a target for whispers, stares, and, as he was about to discover, something far more sinister. As Marcus made his way through the dimly lit park near his home, he noticed a police cruiser slowly trailing him. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. But as the car came to a stop and two officers stepped out, Marcus's stomach dropped. He could see it in their eyes, the kind of suspicion that was all too familiar. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers said, his voice dripping with authority. "We've had reports of someone matching your description involved in some questionable activities around here." Marcus froze. He hadn't done anything. He didn't know of any reports. But he also knew better than to argue right away. He had seen how these situations could spiral out of control. "I'm just heading home," he replied calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. The second officer, a younger man with a hard glare, wasn't convinced. "We're going to need to see some ID," he demanded. Marcus hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was really about identification or something more. Before he could respond, the situation escalated. The officers began questioning him aggressively, their tone growing sharper with every word. They accused him of things he hadn't done, crimes he couldn't have committed. Marcus felt trapped, surrounded, as if the world was closing in on him. As the accusations piled up, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of a familiar injustice. He had been judged not for who he was, but for what they assumed him to be. The officers' voices grew louder, their accusations more baseless. Passers-by began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus knew he had a choice to make: stay silent and let the officers control the narrative, or speak up and reveal something that would change everything. Taking a deep breath, he decided it was time to put an end to this farce. "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but steady, with a hint of something the officers hadn't expected: confidence. The question caught them off guard. They exchanged a glance, unsure of what he meant. What Marcus revealed next would not only dismantle their case, but leave everyone watching in stunned silence. The officers' assumptions, their tactics, their entire approach, everything was about to backfire spectacularly. And just like that, the world stopped spinning for a moment. Marcus's truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The crowd waited, breathless, as the officers scrambled to figure out what had just happened. Little did they know, their entire case was about to collapse in the most unexpected way. The air felt thick with tension as Marcus stood his ground, his calm demeanor only amplifying the chaos unfolding around him. The two officers, visibly unnerved by his sudden confidence, exchanged glances. They had expected fear, hesitation, compliance. This was something else entirely. Marcus had said only a few words, but the way he carried himself was enough to unsettle them. "Look," the older officer said, his tone shifting slightly as if trying to regain control of the situation. "We're just doing our job here. If you have nothing to hide, then there's no need for all this attitude. Just show us some ID, and we'll sort this out." But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze unwavering. "I know exactly what you're doing," he said, his voice steady. "And I know you don't have anything on me." The younger officer, clearly more agitated, stepped closer. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he snapped, his hand hovering near his belt. The crowd around them grew larger, their whispers and murmurs creating an undercurrent of unease. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of this encounter. Marcus could feel the weight of those watching eyes, the silent hope that he might stand up against what many in the community had experienced before. He wasn't just speaking for himself now. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, judged without reason, or silenced by fear. "I'll show you my ID," Marcus said finally, reaching into his pocket. The officers straightened, their faces hardening as if preparing to validate their assumptions. But Marcus wasn't done yet. "But first," he continued, pulling out his wallet, "let me ask you something. Did you even bother to check the reports you mentioned? Or were you just looking for someone who looked like me?" The question hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The older officer hesitated, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for the right words. The younger one, however, scoffed. "We don't need to explain ourselves to you," he said. "Now hand over your ID." Marcus's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, you'll get it," he said, pulling out a sleek, laminated card. He held it up for everyone to see, the light catching on its surface. The officers leaned in to take a closer look, and their expressions shifted almost immediately, from confidence to confusion, and then to something that looked an awful lot like panic. It wasn't a regular ID card. It wasn't a driver's license or a state-issued ID. No, this card was something much more significant. The crowd, sensing the shift in the officer's demeanor, began murmuring louder. People moved closer, straining to see what had caused the sudden change in the officer's attitudes. "You've got to be kidding me," the younger officer muttered under his breath, his face reddening. The older one shot him a warning look, but it was too late. The crowd had heard him, and their curiosity turned into quiet outrage. "What is it?" Someone in the crowd called out. "What's on the card?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the tension build, holding the card firmly in his hand as the officers struggled to compose themselves. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You spent the last 10 minutes accusing me of things I didn't do," he said. "But if you'd done your homework, you'd know exactly who I am." The older officer, now visibly sweating, trying to take control of the situation. "All right, enough of this," he said, his voice shaky. "We'll sort this out at the station." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A station," he repeated. "You really think that's going to end well for you? I've got nothing to hide. But you've got everything to lose." The crowd's murmurs turned into murmured agreement, a ripple of support that bolstered Marcus's stance. The officers, realizing they were quickly losing control of the narrative, began to backpedal. "Let's just take a step back," the older officer said, raising his hands in what he probably thought was a calming gesture. "We don't want this to get out of hand." Marcus tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Out of hand," he echoed. "You mean like how you approached me for no reason, accused me of crimes without evidence, and tried to intimidate me into compliance? Or are you talking about how you were being recorded by half the people here?" The younger officer finally snapped. "All right, that's enough," he barked. "You're coming with us." He reached for his handcuffs, but before he could take another step, Marcus did something no one expected. He stepped back, holding his hands up in mock surrender, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Go ahead," he said. "Arrest me. Let's see how that works out for you. But just so you know, I'll be making a call to my office the second I get there. And trust me, you'll regret every decision you've made tonight." The officers froze, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. His office. What kind of office? The crowd, now fully invested, erupted into hushed speculation. Was he a lawyer? A journalist? Someone with connections? The mystery of his identity only deepened the tension. The older officer, realizing they were trapped, motioned for his partner to stand down. "Let's take a moment," he said, his voice low but firm. He turned to Marcus, his expression pleading. "Why don't we just talk this out?" But Marcus wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You want to talk? Fine. Let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about how you've treated me tonight, and how you've treated others like me before. Let's talk about what happens when the truth comes out." The younger officer opened his mouth to argue, but the older one cut him off. "All right," he said, raising his hands. We'll back off. No harm done." "No harm done," Marcus repeated, his tone incredulous. "You think you can just walk away from this?" The officers didn't respond. Instead, they turned and began retreating toward their cruiser, their steps hurried and clumsy. The crowd jeered, their voices rising in a chorus of frustration and anger. But Marcus didn't join in. He simply stood there, watching as the officers drove away. The crowd turned to Marcus, their eyes filled with questions. But Marcus didn't answer them. Not yet. He knew the truth would come out eventually, but for now he had made his point. And as he slipped the card back into his pocket, he couldn't help but smile. The game had only just begun. As the officers drove off, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the distance, but Marcus stood still, lost in his thoughts. He could feel the eyes of the few who remained on him, their expressions a mix of admiration, confusion, and curiosity. The power of the moment still hung in the air, but Marcus knew the real battle was only just beginning. It wasn't just about this one encounter. It was about the larger fight for respect, dignity, and justice that so many in his community had been enduring for years. Behind him, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement. A sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach, not from fear, but from knowing that his actions tonight would inevitably lead to a ripple effect. He had made his stand, but the consequences were yet to unfold. The officers' retreat was just the beginning of a much bigger story that was about to break wide open. As he turned and began walking home, his mind raced. Marcus had always tried to keep a low profile. He wasn't one for confrontation or stirring the pot. But tonight had changed everything. He had witnessed the unfairness firsthand, the racial profiling, the assumptions, the accusations without any shred of evidence, and he had had enough. But he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen now? Would this be the end of it, or would the officers try to silence him? As he reached his doorstep, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, already knowing who it was. It was his sister, Tasha. They had talked about the struggles of their community many times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, Marcus had seen the ugly side of law enforcement up close, and Tasha had always been more outspoken than he was about these issues. He answered the phone, his voice weary. "Hey, Tasha." "Marcus, what the hell just happened?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. "I've been watching the video. You really called them out like that?" Marcus leaned against the doorframe, staring at the pavement below. "Yeah, I did. They were accusing me of things I didn't do. They tried to intimidate me, and I wasn't about to let that happen." There was a long pause on the other end. Tasha knew Marcus wasn't the type to stir things up unless it was absolutely necessary, and the fact that he had gone to such lengths meant this was more than just a small misunderstanding. "You know they're not just going to let this slide, right?" she finally said. "You've made yourself a target now. They won't stop at just letting you walk away." Marcus sighed. He had thought about that too. The system wasn't designed to let people like him speak out without consequences. He had seen it happen to others before. How the system could turn against someone who simply refused to comply. How quickly things could spiral out of control when they wanted to silence you. "I'm not worried," Marcus said, though even as he said the words, he could feel the unease creeping back into his mind. "They're trying to break me tonight, but I'm still standing." Tasha wasn't convinced. "Look, Marcus, you're not alone in this. We've been fighting this fight for years, but this is different. You've got the power of the whole community behind you now. Don't back down." Marcus felt a flicker of something in his chest, a spark of hope. Tasha was right. The community had always been there, quietly supporting one another, sharing stories of injustice and pain. But now, with social media amplifying every detail, the world was paying attention. He ended the call and headed inside, locking the door behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the officers hadn't given up just yet. They might have retreated for now, but Marcus knew better than to think that meant they were done. The next few days, maybe even weeks, would be critical. He had to be ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, Marcus kept a low profile. He stayed home more often, keeping to himself, spending time with his thoughts, and trying to figure out how best to navigate the storm that seemed to be brewing. But even in his quiet home, the weight of what had happened lingered. News outlets began picking up the story. An innocent man accused, officers backed off, but there was still an underlying question hanging in the air. Why had they targeted Marcus in the first place? The tension only grew when a local activist named Mia Walker, known for her outspoken work in the community, began speaking out about the incident. Mia was no stranger to the fight for justice, and when she got wind of what had happened to Marcus, she knew she couldn't let it go unnoticed. Marcus, Mia said when she finally reached out to him, this isn't just about what happened that night. This is about the larger pattern of racial profiling and systemic abuse we've been fighting for years. We need your voice in this. The more people who see this, the bigger the impact we'll have. At first, Marcus hesitated. He had never been one to put himself in the spotlight, and the idea of becoming a symbol for something larger than himself felt overwhelming. But Mia's words resonated with him. She wasn't asking him to be some sort of martyr. She was asking him to stand up for the truth, for those who had been silenced for too long. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Marcus said, his voice filled with uncertainty. I'm just one guy. I didn't want to get caught up in something I can't control. Mia's response was steady, firm. You don't have to do it alone, Marcus. There's a whole community behind you, waiting for someone to lead the charge. And you've already done that just by speaking out. Marcus paused. Maybe she was right. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his silence could only perpetuate the same cycle. His truth, his experience, it had the potential to spark something bigger than himself. But it also came with a cost. As he sat down at his desk later that night, Marcus couldn't shake the growing realization that things were changing. And there was no turning back. The officers, the system, even the media, they would all have a part to play in what came next. And Marcus, whether he liked it or not, was right in the middle of it. He just hoped he was ready. As the days dragged on, the tension only increased. Every time Marcus stepped outside, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His every move seemed scrutinized. People in the neighborhood, who had always nodded in passing, now looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. He wasn't just a man walking down the street anymore. He was a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. The media had picked up the story, and it was everywhere, on the news, social media, and even in local gossip. Some praised Marcus for standing up to the officers, for challenging the system. Others, though, painted him as a troublemaker, someone looking to stir the pot where there was no need. But Marcus didn't care about their opinions. He had his own fight to face. Mia, the activist, had been relentless, pushing Marcus to make his stand public. She wanted him to speak at rallies, to appear on interviews, to be the voice of the community. But Marcus wasn't so sure. The more attention the story got, the more he felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. Still, he agreed to meet with Mia, knowing she wouldn't back down. Marcus, this isn't just about you anymore, she said during one of their conversations. It's about everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been pushed down. You're the spark, but you can't back off now. He knew she was right, but the thought of exposing himself even further felt like walking into a storm he might not survive. Every time he thought about speaking out more, about making it a bigger issue, he imagined the officers, the ones who had harassed him, coming for him. They wouldn't forget. They wouldn't just let it slide. Then came the call he had been dreading. It was late, almost midnight, when his phone rang. He picked it up with a sense of foreboding, already knowing who it was. The voice on the other end was strained, panicked. Marcus, it's Tasha. They're here. They're outside. His heart skipped a beat. Who's outside? What do you mean? They're here. The cops. They're parked down the street. I don't know how long they've been there, but they've been sitting there for hours. I saw them when I went to the window. Panic surged through Marcus, but he forced himself to stay calm. What do they want? I don't know, Tasha replied, her voice cracking with fear. But I'm not staying here alone. You need to come back. Now. Marcus hung up the phone, his mind racing. The officers have returned. He knew this wasn't just a random patrol or coincidence. They were here because of him. The video, the attention, the pressure. It was all coming to a head. But why tonight? Why now? He rushed out of his house, his footsteps echoing the quiet night air. As he walked down the street, he could see the flashing lights of a squad car parked in front of his sister's house. The sight of the vehicle sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. This was a message, a warning. Marcus approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows, hoping not to be seen. He tried to think clearly, trying to come up with a plan, but his mind was clouded with fear and uncertainty. Tasha's safety was all that mattered now. He couldn't let anything happen to her. As he reached the house, he saw a figure standing by the front door, a tall, imposing officer with his back to him. There were two others near the cruiser, talking in low voices. Marcus's pulse quickened. This was bad. This was very bad. He didn't know what they were doing here, but he had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to be good. He needed to find out. He crept closer, staying hidden behind a nearby tree, trying to listen in. His thoughts raced. What if this was their way of intimidating him? What if they were here to silence him, to send a message that he couldn't speak out without facing the consequences? Just as he was about to move closer, the door to the cruiser opened, and another officer stepped out. This one was different, a woman. She was older, her expression unreadable. She glanced around before walking towards a group of officers by the door. The officers seemed to exchange glances when they saw her approach. Something about the interaction felt off, like the atmosphere shifted suddenly. Marcus couldn't put his finger on it, but it was enough to make him freeze, unsure of what was about to happen. The older officer, the one Marcus had seen during the encounter in the park, turned toward the new arrival. "We're just waiting for confirmation," he said gruffly, glancing at his watch. "Then we'll proceed." Confirmation? Proceed with what? Marcus's stomach churned with dread. What did they need to confirm? What were they planning? He stayed still, trying to catch every word, every movement. He needed to know what was going on, but he also knew he couldn't get too close. If they saw him, it would be over. He'd be dragged into whatever this was, and he couldn't afford that. Not with Tasha inside. The officer continued to speak, but the words became muffled in Marcus's ears. His focus was entirely on the woman who had joined them. There was something about her, something different. She didn't look like the usual cops patrolling the streets. She carried herself with a quiet authority that set her apart from the others. The tension was palpable, and Marcus knew he couldn't wait much longer. He had to make a move. He had to find out what was happening. The longer he stood there, the more it felt like they were waiting for something. Something big, something that could change everything. He couldn't let them catch him off guard again. Before he could act, he heard a faint noise from behind him. A soft rustling, the sound of footsteps. Marcus whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. But it wasn't another officer. It was Tasha, standing at the edge of the driveway, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "You need to get out of here," she whispered urgently. "They're going to do something. They're going to make an example of you, Marcus." His mind raced. The officers were preparing for something, and Tasha had seen enough to know they weren't just going to walk away. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everything he had been fighting for. The clock was ticking, and he had no idea how much time he had left before everything exploded. Would he walk into the storm? Or would he fight back, even if it meant risking everything? Tension built in his chest as he locked eyes with Tasha. They both knew it was time to act. Marcus's heart pounded as he exchanged a quick, desperate glance with Tasha. They both knew they couldn't stay hidden much longer. The officers were circling the house now, their voices growing more distinct, their presence more intimidating. Marcus could feel the heat of the situation building, the pressure mounting, but something was gnawing him. Something wasn't adding up. Why had they come here in the dead of night? What were they planning? As Tasha started to speak, her voice barely a whisper, Marcus held up his hand to silence her. His instincts kicked in. His eyes darted from the officers to the cruiser, and that's when he saw it. A car parked at the far end of the street. The lights were off, but the silhouette of the vehicle was unmistakable. It wasn't a patrol car. It wasn't even a car he recognized. And then, just as Marcus was about to move toward the car, something unexpected happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the street lamp. It was a man tall, his face partially obscured by a hood, but his posture was confident, purposeful. He didn't look like someone who was part of the neighborhood. In fact, he didn't look like he belonged in this town at all. Marcus's mind raced. Was he another officer? Someone from outside the precinct? His instincts told him this wasn't just a random bystander or passerby. This man was here for a reason. He watched as the figure approached the officers by the house. The woman cop seemed to stiffen as the man spoke to her, their conversation low but urgent. Marcus strained to hear what they were saying, but the distance was too far. The words didn't matter, though. The way they spoke to each other, like they were in on something, confirmed what he had already suspected. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. Tasha, still at his side, looked confused. Who's that? What's going on? Marcus didn't answer right away. He was too focused on the interaction unfolding before him. The man exchanged a few more words with the officer, and then, in one swift motion, he handed her something small, something that glinted under the streetlight. It was a flash drive, or at least that's what it looked like. Marcus's blood ran cold. What was on that drive? Was it something that could change everything? The woman officer pocketed it quickly, glancing around nervously before walking back to the group by the cruiser. The tall man turned and walked back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Marcus's pulse quickened. He didn't need to be a detective to know that something was going on. Something much darker than a simple case of mistaken identity. Whatever was on that flash drive, whatever was so important, it had brought these officers back to his doorstep. And now, with this strange man involved, things were spiraling out of control. What the hell is that about? Tasha whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Marcus replied, his voice tight with tension. But whatever it is, it's not just about me anymore. They're hiding something, and I think it's bigger than I could have imagined. Just as he spoke, the officer's car doors slammed shut, and the group began moving toward the vehicle. Marcus instinctively took a step back into the shadows, hoping they wouldn't notice him. He didn't have to hide for long, though. The officers drove off, their headlights illuminating the dark street before they vanished around the corner. Marcus stood still for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. The flashing lights, the mysterious figure, the flash drive. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even begun to solve. His gut told him they were hiding something. But what? And why was it so important that they would risk everything? His life, his freedom, and even the safety of his sister, just to cover it up. You need to figure out what's going on, Marcus, Tasha said quietly, pulling him from his thoughts. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back. We need to know what they're hiding. Marcus nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He couldn't stay here and wait for the next move. He needed answers. He had to know what was on that flash drive, and why the officers were so desperate to keep it hidden. He was in deep now, deeper than he ever imagined, and there was no turning back. I'm going to find out what they're hiding, he said, his voice steady. And when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. But as Marcus turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. A creeping sensation, like eyes in the darkness, following his every move. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Someone was keeping tabs on him. Someone who wasn't going to let him expose whatever secrets lay hidden in that flash drive. And in that moment, Marcus realized that he wasn't just up against a few rogue officers. He was up against something much bigger. He had walked into a web of corruption, and he had no idea just how deep it went. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy, and the stakes had just been raised higher than ever before.